Hi, I'm Kelsey Njembu. I'm a senior in high school, and my topic was Why Medicine Hurts Black Women More Than It May Help, a systematic review on the effects of stereotypes on Black women's health. And I worked with my mentor, Marissa Tate, and thank you so much for mentoring me once again. So, Black women are the most underserved demographics in regards to receiving quality health care. They often face the most health disparities when compared to their white counterparts. Although lack of access to healthcare due to finances is a huge factor, one overlooked factor is their willingness to receive healthcare due to their experiences in the clinical setting and the history of mistreatment within healthcare. I wanted to talk about how stereotypes affect Black women because that's like a really important topic for me as a Black woman, of course. And it's really sad to see that a lot of women are not able to get the healthcare they need simply because things like stereotypes affect them. And after I examined multiple articles, the results showed that stereotypes did indeed lead to more negative health outcomes. And this review analyzes why Black women have poorer health than their white counterparts by examining the underlying racial discrimination that affects their clinical experiences. In order to produce better health outcomes, it's necessary to recognize and counter the effects stereotypes have on their clinical experiences. So before I get into stereotypes and like their effect and everything, I of course have to define it. So according to Hilton and Hipple, stereotypes are beliefs about the characteristics, attributes, and behaviors of members of certain groups, and they're used in the context of social interactions. Stereotypes they can be a positive thing as they help people respond to new situations rapidly. For example, you might not want to ask a super muscular biker for directions since they're usually seen as dangerous. And it gives humans a way of categorizing others. But of course, it is definitely a negative thing as it makes people make generalizations about others and overlook differences that exist between individuals. Stereotypes, both negative and positive, are harmful to the group being stereotyped. And negative stereotypes, such as the belief that African Americans are lazy, can cause others to think that the stereotype group member fits this specific attribute, even though it probably does not apply to them at all. And even positive stereotypes can be harmful as well, such as the model minority myth, which is the idea that Asian Americans achieve more academic and occupational success compared to other minorities. And although it may seem harmless and positive that, oh, we're saying that they're smart, but this causes them to experience more pressure to conform to this stereotype. And in turn, this pressure acts as a stressor that can impact their willingness to engage in learning processes. And with stereotypes comes something called the stereotype threat, which is a threat that arises when one is in a situation or doing something for which a negative stereotype about their group applies. So this is the idea that an individual may feel threatened in certain environments where they're likely to be stereotyped. These environments can include people from outside the individual's group, for example, Black students in a classroom of white students, as they'll fear that they're going to be judged stereotypically, and they also fear that they may conform to the stereotype, which impacts their performance. And one field that the stereotype threat is more commonly known for is an academic field. Studies have shown that the stereotype threat affects African Americans and women in academic settings, such as in one study where African Americans and white subjects participated in a test. It was the GRE test, and they had to answer the questions, and they were all on the graduate level, so they all knew the type of questions they were being asked, and they could answer them. But in the setting where the Black subjects' stereotypes were emphasized, they ended up performing worse than when they weren't really aware of the stereotypes. So the stereotype threat does indeed, in fact, impact their performance. And it also impacts the healthcare field as well, which is evident by the healthcare stereotype threat. And this is the idea that, sorry, one second. Okay, my computer like froze. Sorry about that. So this is the idea that the threat of being personally reduced to group stereotypes that commonly operate within the healthcare domain, this will impact one's willingness to pursue healthcare. And this is usually with stereotypes regarding unhealthy lifestyles or inferior intelligence. And usually, this is the reason why Black women don't actively seek healthcare. So, yeah, my study is going to go over that. And I used multiple sources to find articles for my literature review. I used PubMed, Google Scholar, and ResearchGate. And this little chart right here basically shows my process for excluding certain articles. And for my inclusion criteria, I included those that were in the English language, that were published in the last 10 years. They had to be original work, and they had to talk about Black women in healthcare settings and how stereotypes affected their health. So by the end, I was left with 3 articles for my review. Okay. And for the results, one of the articles was a 2014 study that applied the stereotype threat to the health sciences. It was one of the first of its types. And basically, it measured anxiety levels of Black women and white women during a virtually simulated visit to the doctor. The researchers hypothesized that Black women would have higher anxiety levels than white women, and this anxiety, the level of their anxiety would also be moderated by how strongly they identified with their ethnicity. So they hypothesized that those who highly identified with being Black would have more anxiety levels in a clinical setting. And the results show that this was indeed true. In the condition where there was high ethnic identification and they were faced with the stereotype threat, Black women had significantly higher anxiety levels compared to white women. And in the no threat condition, Black women with high ethnic identification still experience more anxiety than white women. And I forgot to provide the context as well. The stereotype threat condition was basically in the virtual doctor's office. The stereotype threat condition had different posters that they basically emanated stereotypes about Black women, such as one poster it was talking about teen pregnancy, and there was a pregnant Black teen on the poster. So posters like that were supposed to cause them to think more about the stereotypes that affected them, and thus that was called the stereotype threat condition. The next study was on gendered racism and how it affects the health of Black and Latina women. So, in this study, the researchers hypothesized that Black and Latina women would report greater stereotype related gendered racism and birth control related mistrust than white women would. And in turn, the greater stereotype related gendered racism would be associated with more pregnancy specific stress. So basically, this study was conducted with, I believe it was 2 different studies it had. One was just with participants from New York, and the other was with participants from across the US. And in both studies, they were asked about their ethnic identification, and like they were made aware that they identified with being Black or identified with being Latina. And then they were also given a questionnaire that assessed their concerns about pregnancy. And both studies showed that Black and Latina women reported greater racism, stereotype related gendered racism, and birth control mistrust compared to white women. And the third study I went over was Controlling Images, How Awareness of Group Stereotypes Affects Black Women's Well-Being. And this study specifically examined the effects of being aware of stereotypes on Black women's physical and mental well-being. The researchers hypothesized that being aware of these stereotypes, which is called meta-stereotype awareness, would result in more negative mental health outcomes, which in turn would result in less self-care and more drug and alcohol use for coping. Participants were gathered from 2 colleges in the United States. One was a predominantly white institution, and the other was an HBCU. And to assess their awareness of common stereotypes, they adapted popular scales such as the 7-item Modern Jezebel scale and the 9-item Strong Black Woman scale. And these questions were modified to, of course, fit the study. And the results showed that meta-stereotype awareness did indeed correlate with more mental health symptoms and using drug and alcohol for coping. Okay. And now on to the discussion. So, stereotypes clearly have a significant negative effect on Black women's mental health. And before examining how these stereotypes affected their health, it's important to recognize the stereotypes that actually exist for Black women. One of them is the welfare queen. This classifies Black women as lazy mothers who collect welfare from the government and shun their children and pass on their bad values to them. It emerged during the post-World War II economy when African Americans, they still struggled with receiving the rights that their white counterparts did, and thus the government expanded the social welfare policies and they created new things such as like compensation for unemployment and social security, and these really helped African Americans with having more economic freedom in a way. So as Black women use these resources, um, they were basically seen as being lazy since they didn't work as jobs that were available. The jobs that were available to them were low income jobs, and it wasn't enough to sustain them and their families. So they typically relied more on these welfare policies. And in turn, this was contrary with the white American values of self sufficiency and hard work. So they were criticized for it. And that's how this stereotype emerged. And another one is called the Jezebel, which generalizes Black women as sexually aggressive. This emerged during slavery as a rationale for the widespread reports of white men assaulting enslaved Black women. And this stereotype was used to prove that it was not the white man's fault, but instead the Black woman's, since she apparently had an abnormal sexual appetite. And typing Black women as Jezebels and welfare queens and other stereotypes that relate to Black womanhood and sexuality and pregnancy are what led to the increased pregnancy specific stress in the other study that I discussed earlier. And since in that study they were more aware of and concerned about the stereotypes that affected them, so this fear of being judged on these stereotypes is evidence of the stereotype threat and how it affected their health as they had more stress because of these stereotypes. And simply being aware of stereotypes increased the negative mental health symptoms of Black women. In the 2017 study by Gerald and his colleagues about the meta stereotype awareness and its effect on negative mental health, this can be explained by the fact that stereotypes are a form of racial discrimination, and it has been shown that being exposed to racial discrimination acts as a stressor, which causes a stress response and negatively impacts the body's health. So, being aware of these stereotypes and knowing that they'll be judged for them is what ultimately led to their negative mental health symptoms. And in turn, these increased mental health symptoms also correlated with using drugs and alcohol to cope. As we've already said, Black women feel more anxiety when they're in a clinical setting, so they're less likely to go and be in a clinical setting and get treated for these things. So since this stereotype threat it creates an unpleasant environment, Black female patients are more likely to avoid their healthcare providers and instead use methods such as drugs and alcohol to cope, amongst other methods. Of course, this is not the only thing they would use, but this would explain the correlation between negative mental health symptoms and drug and alcohol use in that specific study. And also, when discussing the results, it's important to also recognize the physician bias that also exists due to stereotypes. Um, as the Black women in the studies were reminded about the stereotypes they face, they were afraid that the physician would judge them based on them. And this is actually completely logical in their perspective because studies have shown that a patient's racial status affects the physician's perceptions of them, such as in one study, physicians they rated more whites than blacks to be at low risk for substance abuse. And they also said that more whites would have no risk for noncompliance with medical advice and were half as likely to perceive blacks as desiring an active lifestyle. And physicians were also less likely to agree that Black patients were people that they would be friends with, showing that feelings of affiliation between physicians and Black patients were lower than white patients. And these findings reflect something called implicit bias, which is attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious way, making them more difficult to control. Since these physicians harbored implicit bias against African Americans, this negatively affected their perception, and the Black female participants had poorer mental and physical health outcomes, not just because that they were aware of the stereotypes, but because they were aware of the bias that physicians held against them due to these stereotypes. And the whole thing with physician bias also is like something to do with history as well, as historically Black women have been mistreated by healthcare providers. Um, One example is with Dr. Sims, who was known as the father of gynecology. He developed the first successful operation for a vesicovaginal fistula by repeatedly operating on enslaved African American women, with one woman undergoing 30 operations. And these procedures were done unethically without anesthesia or informed consent. And after developing the operation, Sims did use anesthesia on his white female patients, as they said they could not withstand the pain that the Black women were allegedly capable of enduring. He abused his power as a white man in antebellum America and performed these painful procedures on enslaved Black women. So things such as this that have happened in history could definitely explain why Black women now have this fear of seeking medical treatment. Yeah. So despite being aware of everything with physician bias and the history of mistreatment, um, unconscious bias still persists among healthcare providers. And one way that this problem could be improved is is using more proper cultural competence training, as this would help Black women feel less threatened in clinical encounters. Cultural competence is the ability to provide care to patients with a diverse range of values, beliefs, and behavior. So training physicians to be more accepting of people who are of different races, ethnicities, genders, things like that, that would improve the patient experience in the clinical setting, and therefore they'd be more willing to go to the doctor and actually seek treatment. And in the long term, increased prevalence of Black women in the healthcare industry would also help patients feel more comfortable in clinical settings. Black women have said that they would feel less anxiety with physicians who have the same racial and gender identity, since there's a lower possibility of being judged based on the stereotypes. So having more Black women in the healthcare industry would ultimately help the problem a lot more than just competence training as well. So the healthcare industry ultimately needs to be diversified, and physicians need to recognize and combat their implicit biases to reduce the stereotype threat for Black women and increase their positive health outcomes and attitudes towards health. So yeah, that was pretty much all for my paper. Now I'm gonna go into talking about the mentoring experience. I work with Marissa. It was a like just amazing experience overall. I really loved working with her. When I first met her, I was honestly terrified to start doing this because I had never done research at all. I didn't really know what I was doing. I didn't even know what my topic was. I just knew I wanted to talk about stereotypes and how it affected Black women, but I didn't have any concrete ideas whatsoever. But after talking to her just for an hour, I already figured out my entire topic. And she sent me a lot of resources that were very helpful. And just from initially from that first meeting, I knew that she was going to be the best mentor ever. And even when I found her as I was searching for mentors, I had noticed that she was also a first generation American, and her parents are also from Cameroon, just like me. So I felt a really big personal connection with her, and I was really happy to work with her. And throughout the experience, as I was writing, um, one challenge I definitely had was probably thinking that I wasn't writing up like to a certain standard. I felt like my writing wasn't as strong as it could be, and I was sometimes afraid to show her my work, but I didn't need to be afraid at all because ultimately she was very kind and she helped me and she let me know like what worked and what didn't work. And if it didn't work, she told me how I could fix it. So overall, working with Marissa was definitely great. And just in overall, this entire program was great. Without Talaria, I wouldn't have had any way to have any research experience whatsoever in high school. And the fact that it's a completely free program was also a huge thing for me. So thank you for organizing this entire thing. Thank you for working with me, Marissa. And thank you all for listening.